Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're exploring a really pivotal period in North America, roughly 1688 to 1763. It's a time defined by a major power struggle.
That's right. This era is fundamentally about how Great Britain, France, and Spain were all vying for control, and how their interactions shapes the continent's future.
And it's so important to remember, indigenous nations weren't just caught in the middle. They were active, strategic players in this whole dynamic.
Absolutely crucial. Their decisions and alliances profoundly influenced events.
So let's start by sketching out the imperial stakes. What were the main European powers aiming for in North America, say, up to around 1750? Maybe start with France.
Okay, France. Well, they claimed a vast territory, New France, at the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and then all the way down the Mississippi to Louisiana.
That's an enormous area.
It is. But their strategy involved controlling this huge space with relatively few settlers. We're talking maybe 60,000 to 75,000 French colonists by the mid-1700s. It was all about reach.
So how did they manage that? Control such a large area with so few people?
Well, it relied heavily on a network of forts, strategically placed forts, and trading posts. And, critically, strong alliances with numerous indigenous nations.
Alliances were key then.
Definitely. Their economy was built around the fur trade, and that absolutely required indigenous partnership and labor. Trade over dense settlement, that was the French model, really.
Okay, so turning to Great Britain, what were their claims and how did they compare?
Britain held the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Now, their claims often pushed westward, sometimes quite vaguely, sea to sea.
And the big difference was population, right?
Exactly. A much, much larger population. It was growing rapidly, maybe hitting 1.5, even 2 million settlers by the middle of the 18th century. That demographic pressure is just fundamental to understanding the British approach.
And how did that large population shape what Britain wanted?
Well, it fueled their economy, which was increasingly based on agriculture and significantly land speculation. All those people needed land.
Which means pushing west.
Right. That westward expansion was almost constant, and it inevitably brought them into conflict with French claims, especially in places like the Ohio Valley. Land acquisition was a primary driver for the British.
And Spain, where do they fit into this picture during this time?
Spain had the oldest claims, of course. Florida, the Gulf Coast, and the vast viceroyalty of New Spain, parts of which extended into the present-day U.S. Southwest.
But their focus up north was different.
Yes, north of Mexico, their priorities were more about consolidation, defense, and establishing missions and presidios. Those are military forts. These northern territories were essentially buffer zones, meant to protect their richer colonies further south.
So we've got these three distinct approaches. France focusing on trade, alliances, sparse settlement. Britain on agriculture, population growth, land, and Spain on defense and consolidation. How did these inevitably clash?
Well, the clash was almost built in. France needed indigenous alliances and control over interior waterways for their fur trade model to work. This meant trying to keep British settlers east of the Appalachians.
And the British wanted exactly the opposite.
Precisely. British colonists and speculators wanted access to that interior fur trade themselves, but more importantly, they needed land for farming and settlement. That fundamental conflict over land use and access became acute in the Ohio Valley. That's really the crucible.
You mentioned the fur trade being central for France. Can you expand on its significance? How did it shape the imperial geography?
Oh, it was absolutely the economic engine of New France. The demand in Europe, especially for beaver pelts, drove French exploration and really defined their colonial economy.
But it wasn't just the French doing the work.
Not at all. It was entirely dependent on indigenous knowledge and labor. Indigenous peoples were the expert hunters, trappers, processors, and they transported the furs. In return, they received European goods, metal tools, firearms, textiles, sometimes alcohol.
So a relationship of interdependence developed.
Yes, a complex interdependence. But it wasn't without problems for indigenous societies. It created reliance on European goods, sometimes fueled rivalries between different groups competing for furs, and of course introduced devastating diseases and the negative impacts of alcohol.
Was it only the French involved in the fur trade?
No. While it was central to New France, the British were heavily involved too, particularly the New York colony through its relationship with the Iroquois and the Hudson's Bay Company further north. Spanish involvement in the fur trade in their northern territories was less significant during this specific period.
And how did fortifications, these forts you mentioned, fit into this competitive landscape?
Forts were the physical markers of imperial ambition and control. For the French, with their vast but thinly populated territory, forts were essential. They secured trade routes, served as diplomatic centers with indigenous nations, and projected military power.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Islands, Quebec and Montreal on the St. Lawrence, Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, Fort Niagara, Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, and eventually Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. They were all about controlling strategic waterways and access points.
And how did the British respond to this French network?
The British built their own forts, often in direct reaction to French moves or to protect their own expanding frontiers. Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario, for example, was meant to challenge French control in the Great Lakes. They also built forts along the New England frontier.
And the Spanish forts?
Spanish forts, like the Castillo de San Marcos in Florida or fortifications in Pensacola, were primarily defensive, aimed at protecting their territories and shipping lanes from rivals, including the British and the French.
So these forts essentially map out the edges of empire and become flashpoints for conflict. How do the fur trade and the forts together define this imperial geography?
What emerges is a landscape defined by these contested frontiers and strategic bottlenecks. The Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, Lake Champlain, the Ohio River Valley, these become critical zones of competition. Control the water, control the trade. Exactly. Control over these waterways meant control over trade and access deep into the continent. Forts marked the practical limits of power and were often where conflict first erupted. And the fur trade itself, by drawing indigenous peoples into European economic networks, kind of unintentionally paved the way for further settlement and disruption of traditional life.
Indigenous nations were clearly central to the fur trade. Let's talk more about their broader political role. How did they practice diplomacy and navigate this European balance of power?
It's vital to see indigenous nations as active political entities during this time. They weren't just reacting. They had their own goals, their own territories to protect, their own interests to pursue. Groups like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, they were all engaged in sophisticated diplomacy.
And a key strategy was leveraging the European competition.
Yes, absolutely. With multiple European powers needing their alliance, or at least their neutrality, indigenous leaders saw an opportunity to maintain their autonomy and influence. The Iroquois Confederacy is perhaps the best-known example.
Their position between the French and British was key.
It was. Their policy of, well, sometimes called aggressive neutrality, allowed them to play the French and British against each other, protecting their lands and their pivotal role in the fur trade and regional politics for a long time. They wielded considerable influence.
What about other indigenous nations? How did they manage these complex relations?
Well, in the southeast, you see nations like the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee engaging in really complex diplomacy involving the British, French, and Spanish. The Creek, for example, became particularly adept at maintaining relationships with all three to avoid becoming too dependent on any one power.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It absolutely was. They understood that allowing any single European power to become totally dominant in their region was a direct threat to their own survival and sovereignty.
How was this diplomacy actually conducted? What were the methods and customs?
Indigenous diplomacy had its own established protocols. These often involved formal councils for decision-making, the exchange of wampum belts, which served as records of agreements and relationships, elaborate speeches, gift-giving to solidify alliances, and the use of kinship terms, like calling governors father, to frame political relationships.
And their understanding of treaties differed from the European view.
Generally, yes. For many indigenous nations, treaties were seen less as final legalistic documents and more as ongoing relationships that required maintenance, reciprocity, and renewal. This sometimes led to misunderstandings with Europeans. And, of course, existing relationships between indigenous nations, alliances, and rivalries also shaped how they interacted with the Europeans.
So this strategy of playing powers against each other really depended on that continued European competition.
Precisely. Its effectiveness was contingent on having multiple European players to balance. The moment one power achieved clear dominance, as happened later, that leverage was significantly reduced.
Let's turn to the conflicts themselves that resulted from all these tensions. Between 1688 and 1748, there's a series of wars. Can you take us through King William's War and Queen Anne's War?
Okay, King William's War, running from 1689 to 1697, was essentially the North American part of the 9 Years' War in Europe. Here, it mainly pitted New England colonists, often allied with the Iroquois, against New France and their indigenous allies, like the Wabanaki.
What characterized the fighting?
It was marked by pretty brutal frontier raids on settlements by both sides. Schenectady, Salmon Falls, Durham are infamous examples. The English did capture Port Royal and Acadia, but the Treaty of Ryswick that ended it mostly just restored the situation before the war, leaving the core issues unresolved.
So more conflict was likely. What about Queen Anne's War?
Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713 corresponded to the War of the Spanish Succession in Europe. The fighting became more intense and widespread. You had continued raids in New England, like the famous one at Deerfield. Fighting also occurred between the English in the Carolinas and Spanish Florida and French Louisiana.
Did this war have more lasting consequences?
Yes, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 was significant. France ceded major territories to Britain. Acadia, which the British renamed Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay region. Britain also gained the Asiento, a valuable contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. And importantly, the treaty recognized the Iroquois as British subjects, though the Iroquois themselves didn't necessarily agree with that interpretation. It definitely marked a shift in Britain's favor.
So British influence is growing. Fast forward a bit to the mid-18th century, we have the War of Jenkins's Ear and King George's War.
Right. The War of Jenkins's Ear, starting in 1739, was primarily an Anglo-Spanish conflict, sparked by trade disputes in the Caribbean. In North America, the main action was between British Georgia, led by James Oglethorpe, and Spanish Florida. It was more contained than the bigger Anglo-French wars.
And King George's War.
King George's War, 1744 to 1748, was linked to the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe. It brought Britain back into conflict with France, and Spain joined France later. The standout event in North America was the capture of the formidable French fortress of Louisbourg in 1745 by a force of New England colonists.
A major victory for the colonists.
It was seen that way, yes, which made it incredibly frustrating for them when the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, ending the war, gave Louisbourg back to France in exchange for concessions elsewhere. This really fueled colonial resentment and, crucially, did nothing to resolve the simmering disputes over territory, especially in the Ohio Valley.
These constant wars must have taken a terrible toll on ordinary people, particularly on the frontiers.
Absolutely devastating. Frontier communities lived under the constant threat or reality of raids, captivity, displacement. Economic life was severely disrupted. The Deerfield raid during Queen Anne's War is a grim example of the violence civilians faced.
And captivity narratives became quite common.
Yes. Stories written by colonists who had been captured by French or indigenous forces became a popular genre. They reflected the anxieties, trauma, and sometimes the resilience of people caught up in these conflicts.
Amidst all this, were the British colonies able to coordinate their defenses effectively?
Generally, no. There was a persistent lack of unity. You had vast distances, very different economic interests, religious differences, disputes between the colonies over their own borders, and crucially, a real insistence by each colonial assembly on maintaining its own autonomy, especially regarding raising troops and money.
So even facing shared threats, they struggled to cooperate.
Very much so. There were some joint efforts, but effective, coordinated intercolonial defense was the exception, not the rule. This fragmentation was a major headache for British military planners.
Those unresolved tensions, especially over the Ohio Valley, seem to point directly towards the next, much larger conflict. Let's talk about the specific events leading up to the 7 Years' War. George Washington emerges here.
Yes. The Ohio Valley in the early 1750s is ground zero for Anglo-French competition. Both want control of the fur trade, access to the Mississippi, and land for future settlement. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, who had interests in the Ohio Company, sent a young Major George Washington on a diplomatic mission in 1753.
To tell the French to leave.
Essentially, yes. To deliver a message demanding they withdraw from the forts they were building in the region. The French politely refused. So, in 1754, Dinwiddie sent Washington back, this time with a small military force, to assert British presence, specifically at the forks of the Ohio modern-day Pittsburgh.
And things escalated quickly.
They did. Washington learned the French had already seized the spot and were building Fort Duquesne. Then in May 1754, Washington's force, along with indigenous allies led by Tenackerson, the half-king, ambushed a small French detachment nearby at a place called Jumonville Glen.
This is a controversial incident, isn't it?
Extremely. The French claimed Jumonville and his men were on a diplomatic mission. Washington maintained they were spies. The French commander, Jumonville, was killed. The exact circumstances and Tenackerson's role in his death are still debated by historians. but it was undeniably an escalation.
What happened immediately after this ambush?
Washington knew the French would retaliate. He retreated and hastily built a small stockade he called Fort Necessity. Sure enough, a larger French force arrived in July 1754, besieged the fort, and after a difficult battle fought in driving rain, Washington was forced to surrender.
And the surrender terms themselves caused problems.
They did. The articles of capitulation were written in French, which Washington didn't read fluently. He ended up signing a document that used the word assassination to describe Jumonville's death. The French promptly used this admission for propaganda purposes. These events, Jumonville, Glen, and Fort Necessity, are really the opening shots of the French and Indian War in North America.
So the British response to these setbacks was to send over a professional army under General Braddock.
That's right. In 1755, Major General Edward Braddock arrived with 2 regiments of British regulars, supplemented by Colonial militia. His mission was clear: capture Fort Duquesne. George Washington actually served as one of his aides.
But the campaign didn't go as planned?
No, it was a disaster. Braddock faced huge logistical hurdles moving a large army and artillery through the wilderness. He famously cut a road, Braddock's Road, but progress was slow. More importantly, he had little regard for colonial advice on frontier warfare and failed to secure significant indigenous alliances.
And they were ambushed.
Yes, near the Monongahela River, just short of Fort Duquesne, Braddock's column walked into a devastating ambush. A smaller force of French, Canadians, and Indigenous warriors, using forest cover and guerrilla tactics, inflicted terrible casualties on the tightly packed British regulars. Braddock himself was mortally wounded.
A catastrophic defeat for the British. What were the immediate consequences?
Braddock's defeat was a massive shock. It starkly revealed the inadequacy of traditional European tactics in the North American wilderness. It also highlighted how crucial Indigenous allies were allies. The British at that point largely lacked in the Ohio country.
And it left the frontier wide open.
Exactly. The defeat exposed the western frontiers of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia to years of brutal raids. It was a major blow to British prestige and revealed deep problems in the coordination and understanding within the British imperial war effort.
It's clear Indigenous nations weren't just allies, but key strategic players. Let's look closer at their roles, starting with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy.
The Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, occupied a critical geographic position, sort of like a wedge between New France and the northern British colonies. For decades, they had masterfully pursued that policy of aggressive neutrality.
Using their position to their advantage.
Yes, their goal was to protect their own territory, maintain their influence over other indigenous nations, and profit from trade with both the French and the British without becoming fully committed to either side.
And the Covenant chain was part of this, their relationship with the British.
The Covenant chain was this complex, evolving series of alliances and agreements, primarily with the colony of New York. The British often saw it as binding the Iroquois to them, but the Iroquois viewed it more as a relationship between equals, a tool to manage diplomacy and trade on their own terms.
But this neutrality became harder to maintain by the 1750s.
Increasingly so. British westward expansion put immense pressure on their lands and their policy. Tensions grew. In 1753, a prominent Mohawk leader, Hendrik Thénagouin, famously declared the Covenant chain broken due to British neglect and land encroachments.
So how did the Iroquois navigate the French and Indian War itself? Did they pick a side?
It was complicated. The Confederacy tried to stay neutral initially, but unity fractured. Different nations leaned different ways. Many Mohawks, for instance, leaned towards the British, partly due to long-standing ties with figures like William Johnson. Some Seneca groups, on the other hand, fought alongside the French for a time.
But eventually they did align with Britain.
As the war progressed, and it became clear that the British were gaining the upper hand, the Confederacy as a whole formally allied with Great Britain. It was a pragmatic calculation based on the shifting balance of power, aiming to secure the best possible position for themselves in the post-war world. We have to remember, the Iroquois were an indigenous empire in their own right.
What about other indigenous groups beyond the Iroquois? Their alliances must have varied too.
Absolutely. You had the Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine and the Maritimes, who generally remained strong allies of the French, largely seeing them as protectors against relentless British expansion onto their lands.
And in the Great Lakes?
The Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Great Lakes region, the Ojibwa, Odawa, Potawatomi, and others, were crucial French allies. This is the area historians sometimes call the middle ground, where French and indigenous cultures interacted extensively through trade and kinship.
What about the tribes in the contested Ohio Valley?
Groups like the Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingo peoples, many of whom had already been displaced eastward by colonial expansion, were in a precarious position. They sought autonomy and played a complex game, sometimes aligning with the French, who seemed less interested in seizing their land for settlement, but shifting allegiances based on perceived advantage and protection.
And in the southeast.
Down south, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw continued their intricate balance of power politics, dealing with the British in the Carolinas and Georgia, the French in Louisiana, and sometimes the Spanish in Florida. Alliances were fluid, based on trade needs, promises of military support, efforts to preserve land, and internal tribal politics. It's far too simple to label them just pro-French or pro-British.
So the war ends in 1763 with a British victory and French withdrawal. What did this mean for all these indigenous nations?
It was a seismic shift. The removal of the French option dramatically weakened the diplomatic leverage of many indigenous nations. They could no longer play one empire against the other.
And British policies changed, too.
Yes. Under figures like General Geoffrey Amherst, the British ended or drastically reduced traditional practices like gift-giving, which indigenous peoples saw as essential to maintaining alliances. Trade regulations became stricter. This caused widespread anger and anxiety.
Leading to more conflict.
It did. Combined with rapidly increasing settler pressure on their lands, these policies fueled major resistance, most famously Pontiac's War in 1763, a widespread uprising across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley.
How did the British respond to that?
They responded militarily and infamously, resorted to biological warfare in at least one instance, distributing smallpox-infected blankets at Fort Pitt. Eventually, the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
What did that do?
It attempted to manage the situation by drawing a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonial settlement west of that line and reserving those lands for indigenous peoples.
Which didn't go over well with the colonists.
Not at all. Land speculators and ordinary settlers deeply resented this restriction on westward expansion. Meanwhile, for indigenous nations, while it offered some theoretical protection, it didn't stop the pressure, and it formalized their status as subjects under British authority rather than independent nations. The post-1763 world was one of profound uncertainty and challenge for indigenous peoples across eastern North America.
Amidst all this escalating conflict in the 1750s, there was actually an attempt to foster unity among the British colonies, the Albany Congress of 1754. What was the purpose of that meeting?
The British government, specifically the Board of Trade, called the Albany Congress for two main reasons. First, they were worried about the loyalty of the Iroquois Confederacy and wanted to shore up that alliance against the French. Second, they recognized the need for better coordination of colonial defense as war seemed imminent. Representatives from 7 colonies attended.
And this is where Benjamin Franklin proposed his famous Plan of Union.
That's right. Franklin presented a plan for a unified colonial government. It wasn't meant to replace the individual colonial governments, but to create a central authority specifically for handling shared issues like indigenous relations treaties, trade, and defense, including raising an army and taxes to pay for it all.
What was the structure he proposed?
It proposed a president general appointed by the Crown and a grand council elected by the colonial assemblies, with representation based on each colony's financial contributions. The delegates at Albany actually approved the plan.
But it never went anywhere, did it? Why did it fail so completely?
No, it failed spectacularly. Not a single colonial assembly ratified it. The colonies were just too protective of their own power, especially the power to tax and control their own militias. They were deeply suspicious of any central authority, whether colonial or imposed by Britain.
So fear of losing autonomy was the main driver.
Primarily, yes. And the British government wasn't keen on it either. They worried a unified colonial government might become too independent. Plus, at that moment in 1754, the sense of immediate shared danger wasn't strong enough across all the colonies to overcome those deep-seated local loyalties and rivalries.
What's the lasting significance of this failed attempt at unity?
Well, it starkly highlighted the profound disunity among the colonies on the eve of a major war. It showed just how difficult cooperation was. But on the other hand, it was a really important early moment where the idea of shared colonial interests and the potential benefits of union were formally discussed.
And Franklin's Join or Die cartoon came out of this.
Yes, that powerful image was published to support the Albany Plan, symbolizing the idea that the colonies needed to unite for survival. So while the plan failed, it revealed the strength of colonial localism, but also planted a seed for future discussions about unity, lessons that would be remembered later.
Okay, so all these tensions finally boil over into the French and Indian War, the North American part of the global 7 Years' War. You mentioned earlier that William Pitt's strategy turned the tide for Britain. What did he do differently?
William Pitt the Elder, when he came to effectively lead the British war effort, decided to make North America the primary focus of Britain's global struggle against France. He poured money and resources into the war here.
How specifically?
Well, he ensured British naval supremacy, which cut off French reinforcements and supplies. He promoted younger, more aggressive military commanders like Wolfe and Amherst. And critically, he treated the colonies more like partners, promising to reimburse them for much of their military expenses. This really energized colonial participation.
And this strategy led to key British victories.
Yes, it reversed the tide. You see a string of major British successes starting in 1758, the capture of Louisbourg again, Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, which cut French supply lines west, and finally taking Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt.
Setting the stage for the attack on Quebec.
Exactly. These victories opened the way for General James Wolfe's campaign against Quebec in 1759. The dramatic Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm were killed, resulted in a British victory and the surrender of Quebec. Montreal fell the following year, effectively ending French power in Canada. Britain had achieved dominance.
The war officially ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. What were the key terms, and what were the long-term results for the continent?
The Treaty of Paris was a landmark. France ceded virtually all of its territory in mainland North America. Everything east of the Mississippi River went to Britain, except for New Orleans.
And west of the Mississippi.
France had already secretly ceded that vast territory, Louisiana, to Spain in the Treaty of Fontainebleau the year before, partly to compensate Spain for its losses. Spain, in turn, gave Florida to Britain in exchange for getting Havana back, which the British had captured.
So a huge territorial gain for Britain.
Immense. It confirmed British supremacy in eastern North America. For the British colonies, this seemed like a moment of triumph. The French threat was gone, the path west seemed open, but it came at a cost.
Which led to new problems.
Exactly. The war left Britain with a mountain of debt. Their attempts to get the colonies to help pay for it through new taxes like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act led to massive protests, and the Royal Proclamation of 1763 restricting westward expansion angered colonists who felt they'd earned the right to that land. So the victory contained the seeds of future conflict between Britain and its colonies.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into such a complex and consequential period. If you had to summarize the key shifts and dynamics between 1688 and 1763.
We see this dramatic consolidation of imperial power, with Britain ultimately displacing France as the dominant European force in eastern North America. But alongside that, you have the ongoing agency and complex diplomacy of indigenous nations whose worlds are irrevocably changed by the outcome.
And the relationship between Britain and its colonies is fundamentally altered.
Yes, the war effort, while ultimately successful, exposed deep fissures and created new resentments over taxation, representation, westward expansion that would fester and eventually lead to revolution. It also highlighted that persistent colonial disunity, which is ironic given their later union.
It's so important, as you've shown, to see this era not just as a run-up to the American Revolution, but as a profoundly transformative period in its own right, shaping the future for everyone involved.
Absolutely. The consequences of the decisions made, the alliances forged and broken, the lands won and lost during this duel for empire, as some historians call it, echoed for generations.
So a final thought for you, our listener. How did the outcomes of this intense period of conflict and competition continue to shape the development of North America, and perhaps more importantly, the enduring relationships between its diverse peoples long after 1763? It's certainly something to reflect on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.